I just wanted to begin and open up and orient everybody to both who is here and why we're here. And I'll do that succinctly. Who is here are the folks who are responsible for overseeing the investments for the United Church funds, for the pension boards, United Church of Christ, and for the UCC endowment. Along with those investment committee folks are the social responsibility folks, the responsible investing committee of the United Church funds, and the corporate social responsibility committee of the pension boards, as well as investment committee members of the United Church of Christ board. In addition, we have a number of internal staff. Not going to be able to introduce everybody, individually at this meeting, but I thought maybe just, and you'll have a time to meet each other a little bit later on if you stay for the breakout sessions. But I want to just maybe by show of hands indicate who people are. So let's start with the Pension Board's Investment Committee, maybe just a show of hands. Great. Pension Board's Corporate Social Responsibility Committee. United Church Funds Board and Investment Committee. And United Church Funds Responsible Investing Committee. And maybe just one show of hands for staff of the Pension Board's United Church of Christ or the United Church of Christ. Great, awesome. I'm going to try to, we are going to try to, as facilitators, Lon, Kai, Manothi, and I will have a relatively light hand. But we are going to try to keep things moving and give you all the chance and have as much face time as possible because it's a little bit about a conversation. But I'm not going to go on too much. What I wanted to do is just really briefly, before I turn it over to Jim Antal for reasons that will become apparent, I want to just orient us to the day and what to expect and in terms of time frame. So this is a climate symposium and educational opportunity 2021, the first of potentially a number, sponsored by the pension boards, the UCC, and the United Church Funds. We're going to be on for a number of hours today, 4 hours, but we will have ample time for breakouts and respite. I want to really, though, spend a bit of time on the high level objective, at least as we see it now. There may be other things that come out of this, but what we hope to do is really engage participants to begin establishing climate goals for our investing and engagement activities. We hope to accomplish this by taking a look back at an historical context at what's been accomplished by the two organizations on climate, and they are significant. We will situate the work within regulatory policy and investor action frameworks and pledges. So this is the practical aspect of this. I think there'll be really practical tools put in your hands to see what can be done. We will hear about leading edge engagement work with companies, which has resulted in change, and you'll hear more about that. And then finally, the fourth section will be getting a closer look at important elements of a climate transition goal with a focus on opportunities in private markets. So 4 parts. They will start on the top of the hour so that everybody can move in and out as they need to. This opening part will consist of what's happening now, the welcome from me. We will ask Jim Antal to set the stage inspirationally and theologically, and we will highlight past PBUCC and UC work being done in this area. Then we'll have a breakout for 15 minutes. You'll be assigned randomly in smaller groups. Then we have 2 really interesting and exciting panels with outside speakers for the most part, right? The first one will be the current context for investments, which will start at 2 o'clock. And this panel will situate our work, as I said before, within the regulatory policy and investor action frameworks and pledges. Our two speakers, who we will introduce later, are Kirsten Spalding from an organization called Ceres and Chris Kamiker from Lombard ODA. We will then at 3 o'clock have a panel on the current context of engagement, and that's the work to engage companies on changing behaviors. And that panel will include Stephanie Lavallato from ICCR, Matthew Ilian from UCF, and Rick Walters from the pension boards. We'll have another breakout for 15 minutes, short. And then we will wrap up, come close to wrapping up with a section on future opportunities and getting a look at the elements of a 3 to 5 year plan with a review of what the investor community is doing by way of climate action. And we'll have a speaker named Lisa Williams from GSAM, and staff will also participate. So, and then we'll have a final charge if all goes as planned. So anyway, I want to, at this point, reach back a little bit to introduce Jim Antal, who has agreed to open us up theologically and make some connections to where we were in 2013. I don't need to really introduce Jim at great length. He will introduce himself through his speaking. But I want to say that the first time that I ever met Jim, substantively, we'd had some conversations and had some back and forth. But I was at General Synod in 2013. And I was standing between Jim Antal and Mike Downs, our former CEO. And I thought they were going to kill each other. And I was right in between. And it was over really a debate on what Jim was bringing up was really a call for divesting of fossil fuels in all the financial ministries. And Mike, who was stubborn about his fiduciary duty at the pension boards not to sacrifice returns. We've come a long way since then, but I thought it was really important to reach out to Jim, and it was the wisdom of our small steering committee to reach out to Jim to take us back and maybe take us forward to really what's happened over the last 8 years. But Jim, I don't want to steal any of your thunder. Jim, as you know, is a special advisor on climate justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ, is an avid speaker, an expert on climate change, from a theological and a spiritual perspective. So Jim, I'll turn it over to you and let you open it up, and again, so pleased to have you.
Well, Dave, thank you for that stirring introduction. And it reminds me too of some vivid memories. And I really want to thank all the financial leaders of the UCC for convening this important discussion. I'm honored to start this conversation. Let me begin by briefly providing some context. Following the first Earth Day in 1970, our denomination recognized that humanity's relationship to creation was out of whack, and that God was calling people of faith to provide moral leadership required to restore balance to God's creation. Between 1975 and 2009, our UCC Synod passed no fewer than 17 resolutions on the environment, 4 of which were on climate change and 1 on environmental racism, a term coined by UCC leader, the Reverend Dr. Ben Chavez. More than any other denomination, the UCC has proclaimed a biblical and moral mandate to protect and restore God's great gift of creation. This is a great illustration of one of my favorite UCC mottos: we're not radical, we're just early. This motto applies just as well to the financial leaders of our denomination, who recognized way back in the 1970s that there was a moral dimension to investing. Much of the rest of today's gathering will unpack the various ways our UCC financial ministries are witnessing to this commitment. Here's something else about our denomination. As people of faith, we have always paid attention to science and to truth. In 1988, when James Hansen, the world's foremost climate scientist, sounded the alarm in his congressional testimony, UCC congregations heard about this from their pulpits. So too in 1992, when the United Nations convened the first Earth Summit in Rio. This coming November, the United Nations will convene COP26, the 26th gathering of countries to address the climate crisis. Over the 3 decades since the first Earth Summit, the science has become unambiguous. The scientists have amplified their alarm. Nevertheless, since 1992, the world has produced more than half of the CO2 that humans have released throughout all history. And in the 5 years since the Paris Climate Accord, the G20 countries have provided more than $3.3 trillion in subsidies for fossil fuel companies. And one thing more has been going on these past 3 decades. Since the early 1980s, fossil fuel corporations and their think tank partners have spent and continue to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to undermine climate science, to attack climate scientists and activists, to deceive the American public about the realities of climate change, and to buy politicians who will do their bidding. To this day, America remains the only place in the world where climate denial has any political or cultural traction. Thank God that young people throughout the United States began to take a stand and stand up to these lies and deceptions. They were furious that their hopes and dreams were being crushed by grown-ups who were unable or unwilling to face reality and take action. In 2007, activists emerged in 1,400 towns and cities all over the United States. A year later, these young people founded 350.org and the climate movement began. The emerging climate movement was different from the environmental movement of the 70s, 80s, and 90s in 2 crucial ways. First, beginning in 2011, the climate movement began focusing on the supply side of the problem. Stop building pipelines. Stop investing in corporations that deceive the public so that they can continue to profit from wrecking the earth, and stop extracting fossil fuel. Keep it in the ground. Second, the climate movement is an intersectional movement. Since its beginning in 2007, the climate movement has been increasingly led by people of color and indigenous people, and many of these leaders are under 30 years old. Also, from the beginning, the climate movement has recognized that every justice issue you care about, hunger, poverty, homelessness, immigration, disease, lack of access to clean water and education, these justice issues are intersectional. They are not separate and distinct from one another, and climate change is making every one of them worse. 15-year-old climate activist Alexandria Villaseñor exemplifies this thinking when she tweets, "The exploitation of Black people is the greatest extractive system of production of all time." More and more people are realizing that we are no longer living on the same planet we used to call home. And Black and brown and indigenous people know this best because most of them are already dealing with the consequences of the climate crisis. Okay, I provided you with some context and background that will help you understand the significance of Synod's 2013 vote to divest from fossil fuel corporations. Bill McKibben's article in August 2012, proposing that individuals and institutions divest from fossil fuel corporations, it became the most read article in the history of Rolling Stone magazine. It was also met with ridicule, incredulity, mockery, and laughter. Nevertheless, some of us who had been involved in divesting from corporations doing business in South Africa during the apartheid years, some of us were inspired. The Mass Conference UCC Board of Directors were the first to endorse the divestment resolution in December 2012. In the 6 months prior to Synod, 10 additional conferences endorsed the resolution. As the author and chief proponent of the resolution, I reached out to both the Pension Board and United Church Funds. The Pension Board publicly opposed the resolution, favoring instead the strategy of shareholder activism in concert with our denomination's longstanding relationship with the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. I'll come back to that in a moment, but at the time, I pointed out that shareholder activism can and has made a difference when a company has a flaw in their business plan that violates moral norms or needs to be corrected. But shareholder activism cannot succeed when the flaw is the business plan of the company or industry. United Church Funds, they took a different approach. Don Hart and Katie McCloskey worked with me, and we spent hundreds of hours identifying mutually agreeable edits that would make the resolution actionable and would allow UCF to live into the resolution's commitments. When these revisions were presented, Synod passed the revised resolution by a sizable majority. Almost every news outlet in the country covered our action. A Nobel Prize laureate and the head of a major Protestant denomination sent their congratulations, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu emailed me to say, "We hope all will follow your splendid example." And they have. Since the UCC became the first national body and the first religious body to divest from fossil fuel corporations, portfolios worth over $14.5 trillion have purged their holdings of fossil fuel stock. This includes institutions like the several Rockefeller foundations, as well as our own Riverside Church, all built by Standard Oil, now Exxon. And faith institutions make up 35% of the over 1,300 institutions that have divested thus far. This is a response that no one imagined, certainly not Bill McKibben or myself. Churches, philanthropic foundations, and universities began to realize what our UCC Pension Board and United Church Funds leader have long realized, that how we invest our capital matters, not only materially, but morally. However, in 2013, no one in the finance world could imagine having a balanced portfolio without investing in fossil fuel corporations. While the UCC and other socially conscious investors screened out companies that conflicted with their values, tobacco, alcohol, gambling, military products and services, in 2013, it seemed impossible to walk away from investing in oil, coal, and gas. But in response to the 2013 divestment resolution, our United Church Funds, they began to figure out how to create a fossil fuel-free fund, and create it they did. Others here today can say this better than I can, but creating the groundbreaking Beyond Fossil Fuel Funds, UCF did the impossible. And because a rapidly growing number of investors holding trillions of dollars of capital began clamoring for balanced funds that were free of fossil fuel stocks, by 2018, just about every major investment firm offered a fossil fuel-free fund. Let me point out another example of impact. In 2020, Pope Francis urged Catholics to divest from the fossil fuel industry. It's one thing when the moral license of a company or an industry is revoked by the world's most prominent religious leader, or by a widespread social movement. But 2 years before the Pope called for divestment, Royal Dutch Shell, in their 2017 annual report to shareholders, said that if the divestment movement continues, and now I'm quoting, it could have a material adverse effect on the price of our securities and our ability to access equity capital markets, unquote. What many had written off as ineffective, merely symbolic action was suddenly regarded as a material threat by one of the largest corporations in the world. The greatest societal and economic transition in the history of the world is now well underway. For decades, scientists have been sounding the alarm, and the engineers have responded by providing all the technology the world needs to make the necessary changes. Activists are shifting the world's attention to the supply side of the problem by blocking pipelines and suing fossil fuel companies and governments that subsidize them, convincing pension funds, universities, religious and philanthropic institutions to divest, and protesting the banks like JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo that have pumped nearly $4 trillion into the fossil fuel industry in the 5 years since the Paris Climate Accords. As Bill McKibben says, money is the oxygen on which the climate crisis burns. A few months ago, another revolutionary step was taken to address the supply side of the problem. As many of you know, over the past 50 years, there has been a tension between two of the strategies employed by socially conscious investors. One strategy focuses on changing the company from the inside by holding shares and voting on shareholder resolutions to make the company live up to a higher moral standard. Another strategy is to change the company from the outside by organizing a public divestment campaign that seeks to revoke the social license any company needs to continue business. A few months ago, Engine Number One, a tiny activist fund that owned just 0.02% of Exxon shares. They convinced some of the largest shareholders of Exxon stock, like BlackRock, for example, to support 3 dissident board candidates who had pledged to push for climate action. Their efforts succeeded, and now 3 of the 12 members of the ExxonMobil board of directors are committed to climate action. This astonishing outcome makes clear that investors are hungry for change, and that the distinction between change from the inside and change from the outside can be turned outside in and offer hope for the profound and urgent changes we must all embrace. In closing, I want to applaud the financial leaders of the UCC for all that you've done over the past many years, and also lift up the work of UCC Climate Justice Council and our national staff person, Brooks Burnt. Their ongoing witness in virtually every UCC conference exemplifies the decades-long leadership the UCC has offered to the growing environmental justice movement. Again, thank you for allowing me to launch today's conversation.
Thank you so much, Jim. But on the other side of things, it is so important to reconnect to the origin story and where we were in 2013. And yes, there were different stances taken by the two organizations. But I think you've said in subsequent periods of time that you, and just said now, that you applaud the action and the evolution and in some cases revolution in the ways in which we've approached things. And so that's a little bit of what today is about, to both touch base with where we were, to think really about our current state, and then and move us along the trajectory to establishing explicit guidelines and objectives for our activities, so we can sync the two up. But anyway, just join me in thanking Jim. So we've got a 15-minute section here where Lon Minotti and I are really going to go through that progress that has been made by the two organizations, just to remind everybody that we're not at a starting point. And we will follow that by a bit of a breakout. So Sam, if you wouldn't mind turning to the actual presentation that hopefully was delivered to most of you. We'll spend a little bit of time on some diagrams. This is indeed the UCC Climate Symposium, so welcome again. Jim already did this, talked about the timeline, but we thought we'd anchor in your materials some of the things that have been referenced. And gosh, it's 8 years now since the General Synod votes to divest from fossil fuels, among other strategies to combat climate change. Almost to the dot, eight years. It was my second General Synod. I started in 2011, and I was bowled over at all the action at the UCC. Again, just to re-anchor everybody in the agenda, we're going to talk briefly now about our activities to date. We're going to have 2 panels and then a concluding speaker. So what have we done? What have the organizations done? I'm going to start out outlining really what's been done on the pension board side. And then I think Lana Minothi would love if you could just really explicate what's been done on the UCF side. This is not inclusive. This is a busy slide. We couldn't put them all in one. We are one UCC, but in different manifestations. We've outlined really the activities in 3 areas primarily along the ESG and climate impact investing spectrum. Again, not inclusive, but just to anchor everybody in the activities to date. The 3 categories are alignment, integration, and impact investing. This is a Goldman Sachs schematic that we borrowed. Alignment is where our values are attached to the ways in which we construct portfolios. Social responsibility 1.0, shall we say? Or it's evolved somewhat. Integration is really now the science of investing, the tools that are available to integrate environmental considerations into the positive selection of securities. And impact investing really is when you look at what happens when you give an organization money. What is the impact of that capital on society? So briefly outlining, without a commercial for the pension boards of the United Church Funds, this isn't designed to sell anybody anything. It's also not designed to compare the 2 organizations, which are different. I just want to really, again, anchor people in what has been done. At the pension boards, there's exclusionary screening. So all of our managers are unable to invest in a whole host of industries that we cannot bear because of our moral and moral inclinations and our values. And you'll know that amongst the typical industries, firearms, gambling, tobacco, are the important consideration of screening out coal and tar sands company, the worst of the worst of the worst. In addition, one of the options for accumulating members, active members in our plan, is something called the Northern Trust Global Sustainability Index Fund. And this is, Jim, based on best in class in all industries, including climate. It's those who have addressed and have fixed their business models to not have stranded assets, amongst other things. So there's a positive alignment of the Northern Trust Fund, not only in a standalone option, but also as part of a new sustainability balance fund option. Again, no commercial here. So what about integration? How are we selecting managers for climate and human rights and diversity? Well, our team, along with the social responsibility team, does continued due diligence on all these managers. For example, the other day, there were about 7 of us talking to Generations Investment Management, which is Al Gore and David Blood's firm, about some ways in which they are prioritizing climate impact as opposed to focusing on greenwashing, where ESG is the primary consideration, but in fact, turning the world on its head to prioritizing those industries that have the most impact on decarbonization. It was a really, really exciting meeting. Matthew Illian was there, Rick Walters and I were also there. We talked to investors like Impacts, which are providing climate solutions, who is almost a competitor to an organization you'll hear a little bit more about today, Lombard Odier, in our first panel, And there's a firm called Breckenridge Capital who are focusing on each individual security and what they are bond security and what they are doing. They are really at the forefront. Anyway, the point is that we talked to a lot of managers who are really making this next evolution in sophistication in products available to all of us. We care about diversity and equity and inclusion and ESG in all managers in our due diligence and the annual surveys. 95% of our managers are signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, and we'll get to 100. I alluded to the Sustainable Balance Fund that includes a full scope of ESG investing in equities, and 50% of the fixed income securities in that fund are green or sustainable bonds. Almost $350 million invested by the pension boards on behalf of their participants and the United Church funds in green and sustainable bonds. It's an enormous number. Over to the right side of the page, you'll hear more about our ongoing review of private equity impact investments, which are more readily available than at any time in the future. And I've listed a number of those there, and most of you have heard of them, including Neuberger Berman, Impact Private Equity Fund, Lumos, which is providing educational access for underrepresented groups. We have climate strategy transition funds like NCAP. Builders VC is helping antiquated industries reform, and part of that is climate. And fundamental partners, I don't need to get into all specifics, I think you get the idea, but there are a number of investments in the portfolios which are already geared to climate, including fundamental partners and solar installations. And we review that pipeline at least quarterly with our Goldman Sachs folks and take a number of meetings. And then at the bottom here, at the pension board, social responsible guidelines, in addition to the investment policy statement, and working to formalize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have a formative policy for faith and finance, co-authored by Rick Walters. You'll hear more about the manager and shareholder engagement by investing and CSR staff, and proxy voting, the vote of the share. We're signatories to United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing, and affiliations, have affiliations with the United U.S. Social Investing Forum, Series, ICCR, and we are a founding member of ICCR. So next page, some of these are similar and some of them are different from the pension boards. This is over at UCF. And maybe Lon and Minothi, if you could just maybe spend a little bit of time there. Everybody can chime in. Matthew, you can chime in on alignment, integration, and impact investing for the United Church funds.
Thank you, Dave. And at UCF, we're using the same scheme because on this front, we think our missions aligned, that we care about God creation, and that we wanted to have a better environment, and that we really appreciate the opportunity that you all entrust us to be a responsible steward for the assets that we manage on your behalf. And then listening to Jim just now, it's very refreshing because we worked on Beyond Fossil Fuel Fund for UCF. This is the first time that I heard that the vivid origin of the Beyond Fossil Fuel front. So this, I think that this is really a step in the right direction. And then as Dave mentioned, all the separate managed accounts for UCF, like for PB, are all being screened. There are small differences in the screen mechanism, but by and large that we are screening out fossil fuel, thermal coal, tar sands, and along with tobacco and other kind of bad behavior companies. So with that, maybe I will have Minothi to talk about the more exciting front, point 2.0, and then the impact investing on the private side.
Yeah, so I also wanted to add, in terms of the UCF, I believe we're now at 100% of the managers being UNPRI signatories. And so if we kind of look at that middle section there in terms of integration, we have also started to implement a questionnaire that's going to be going out to managers to take a look at what they've done in terms of ESG and climate and where they're headed towards. So that way we can keep track of all our managers and make sure that they're progressing in the right manner. And then on the right-hand side with the impact investing, as Dave noted, we have a couple of investments already made, such as Neuberger Berman's private equity fund. They're already 30% invested in climate. And in terms of their pipeline, about half of their pipeline is associated with climate. And then, as Dave noted, fundamental partners in solar and a couple of other investments. We've also, over the past 2 years, probably met with over 15 different climate funds. And so we continue to, with the assistance of Goldman Sachs as well, which we'll discuss later. But just to reiterate, both organizations are UNPRI signatories, as well as being founding members of the ICCR.
I think we echo the green bond investments on the integration side. Slightly different configuration on the affiliations. UCF is has an affiliation with Climate Action 100, but we, through the work of Rick and Matthew Ilian, are syncing some of our proxy voting activities, including engaging ISS to get some economies of scale and make sure that we're getting a focus on climate and sophistication. But you'll again hear more about that. Okay, so that was a bit of a mouthful. We had a bit of an opening. We heard some inspirational comments from Jim. We wanted to ground you in the reality of where we are. And at this point, we'd like to stop talking for a bit, maybe move out to breakout rooms. Just want to give you all a chance before you go, just a bit of a charge here. This is only going to be 15 minutes. You'll be with some people maybe you don't know or you do know. And just want you to go into the groups and share, if you would, what you've heard, what's appealing to you, what excites you, what frustrates you, what have you make of the progress so far? And then a final question, because we all have clients and participants. Do you think that our participants or clients know about these initiatives?